worship tonight. Amen. Good job. Wow. Goodness. Good to be here again tonight. Let me just pray real quick as we get started in God's Word and ask His blessings. Father, thank you for your Word. Thank you, God, for blessing us tonight that we can come together and study and open our hearts and our minds to hear what the Spirit says. God, give us the wisdom. Give us, God, the words to say. We don't have anything, God. We want your words and your thoughts conveyed. Let us enjoy this time as we study your Word together, Father. May you be blessed. May you be blessed by what we do. Amen. Well, it's good to be back tonight in the book of Daniel. I hope you read chapter 8 before tonight because it is interesting. It is very interesting. You know, God is so cool in the way He reveals things, and He don't just say it. He puts it out there in such interesting ways. And so I'm excited about this chapter tonight. We're probably going to cover maybe half of it. We'll see how far we get. But let me just lay a little bit of groundwork, and we may just walk through these verses and kind of discuss it as we go. When we get to chapter 8, we move into the second and final part of the book. Chapters 2 through 7 was written in Aramaic. Daniel actually written in Aramaic. And so they were directed both to the Jew and the Gentile. So everybody had access to it, no matter, because the Babylonians spoke Aramaic. The Jews spoke Aramaic and Hebrew. So those chapters were written in both. Now, in chapter 8 forward, it's written in Hebrew. In other words, Daniel wrote this just for the Jews. In these chapters, we follow an outline that traced the Lord's work to bring world empires into and out of power. This section serves to emphasize the Lord was in control, that all things were according to His purpose for Israel. Remember, Israel is always the center of the world when it comes to the Lord's working. They would be conquered and oppressed by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles were over, starting with Nebuchadnezzar all the way through the end of the fourth kingdom and the return of Christ. Daniel returns writing exclusively to the Hebrews here, indicating that he's speaking only to a Jewish audience. So there's things that he wants them to know that he don't want the Babylonians to know. And the events described here are some of the most fascinating and important prophecies in the whole Scripture. In chapters 8 through 12, Daniel receives visions that address each of the Gentile nations in the age of the Gentiles. Beginning tonight, Daniel will explain how the Medo-Persians will transition into the Greek Empire, and then later we will learn how the Greek Empire will proceed. And then the fourth kingdom will proceed after that. Finally, we learn the details of how the fourth kingdom comes to its end. Obviously, Daniel doesn't offer a complete accounting of everything that transpires in these kingdoms because there's hundreds of years that transpire through these kingdoms. But what he does is he focuses on how each kingdom impacts Israel and they're trodden underfoot of the city of Jerusalem. And particularly, how each kingdom will accomplish the central purpose of the age of the Gentiles. That is, trampling Jerusalem and the temple. Tonight we'll look at chapter 8, focuses on the second and the third kingdom. Now a lot of this is repetition, and it's interesting that God tells this story 3 times. He tells it to Nebuchadnezzar, He tells it to Daniel in one dream, and then he continues to reveal it to Daniel in another dream. But we're going to find some details tonight that he didn't give to Nebuchadnezzar, and he didn't give to Daniel in his first dream. So he's revealing more and more and more as we get towards the end. So for Daniel and Israel, they were truly prophecy. Of course, for us, they're history up until the fourth kingdom. We can look back and compare notes of what happened with Daniel's prophecy, and you're going to see if you did that, the uncanny accuracy that Daniel prophesied, the things that happened is really interesting. So why is it important if we're looking back? Why is it important that we study the first 2 kingdoms? Why is it important? Well, it's important because those chapters and those prophecies serve to authenticate the later chapters that are coming in the future. So when I look back and see that Daniel prophesied exactly about Babylon, exactly about the Medo-Persians, about the Greeks, then I know that his prophecy concerning the end times at the end of the fourth king and the return of Christ is accurate and it's trustworthy. We also see how accurately Daniel describes the events of the Medo-Persians and Greek empires in this chapters have great confidence in his later prophecies. Because it was just as it was with the statue and the beast prophecy, the focus on the 4 kingdoms is squarely on the final and the fourth kingdom. So let's start. Let's begin in verse 1. We're going to look at the first 4 verses and get right into this chapter tonight. We're going to be looking at the vision of the ram and the goat. The ram and the goat. In the 3rd year of the king Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after one that appeared to me first time. I saw in the vision, and it was so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. I saw a vision that I was by the river Elah, maybe? I'm not sure how you pronounce that. I lifted my eyes and saw that there was standing beside the river, there was a ram which had two horns. The one horn was high, but one was higher than the other, and the high one came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no animal could withstand, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. That's through 4, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about this through verse 4 here. He sees a ram. Now, Daniel always dates his prophecy. You notice that. He talked about when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream. When he had his first, it was in the first or the third year. He always prophesies. He always dates his prophecies, so he lets us know. Now, you're going to notice, if you have been a student, that they're not in chronological order. It ain't like that David had the first vision or Nebuchadnezzar and then Daniel. No, he don't worry about chronology. He's worried about accuracy and details. So it's just like Revelations. I told y'all, when you're studying prophecy, don't ever get caught up in thinking it's chronological, one event after another. It's just when God reveals it. The timeline is not really important. So chapter 7 was dated to the first year of Belshazzar, while chapter 5 was set 15 years earlier in the final hours of the king's rule. So we're jumping around in time, but he's not concerned with that. Daniel's vision begins with the citadel at Susa. Now, if you think about Susa, it's going to ring some bells, because that's where Nehemiah was. Remember, Nehemiah was at the palace in Susa when he heard the news about what was going on in Jerusalem. So what happened was this was a major city, an important city in the Babylonian Empire. It was located about 200 miles east of Babylon and 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf. Susa was in Elam, a province of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. It sat at the edge of the Babylonian Empire, and the city later became the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire after it defeated Babylon. You remember, that's where Artaxerxes was during Nehemiah. So the city has a dual meaning. It represents Babylon's power giving away to the next empire. In Daniel's vision, he has been transported to the city, standing next to this canal, an artificial waterway that connects two rivers near Susa. Daniel's personal involvement in the vision may explain why he moves to talking about himself in the first person. All of the other dream was in the third person, but he's talking to the Jewish people, so he identifies with them. He says, "This is what I see." He makes it more personal. Now remember, he's writing in Hebrew. This suggests Daniel was speaking as an eyewitness directly to the Jewish people concerning their future and what it means. We're told of a ram with two horns standing in Susa, close to this waterway. It says the ram had two horns, one larger than the other. So we try to understand the meaning of the symbolism of the ram. We notice the lopsided nature of the horns, reminding us of the bear back in chapter 7. You remember the lopsided bear. The bear stood lopsided to represent the unequal union of the Medos and Persians. The Persians was far more powerful. In short order, they took control of the complete unions, and the Medos almost went out of existence. So immediately we think that the ram with the unequal horns represent the Medo-Persian Empire. Then we look more closely at the symbolism of the ram itself. We find confirmation. The ram was an important symbol for the Persians. In their pagan religion, the Persians represented their primary god as a ram. The ram's head was carried into battle by the commander of the army. Every time he went into battle, he carried a ram's head. Even in ancient zodiac, the night skies, Persia was associated with Aries, which is the ram constellation. So these horns represent the two-part empire of the Medo-Persians, which by the end of when the Greeks take over, they have become the Persian Empire. The Medos cease to exist because the big horn is so much powerful than the smaller horn. So let's go back and start at verse 5, Valerie, and let's read 5 through 8, as he really gets cool here. You got this ram, which is a male sheep, with two horns, one longer than the other, mighty in power, nobody can handle him. And then he says in verse 5, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat, there's a difference between a male goat and a ram, okay, came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And when he came to the ram that had the two horns, which I seen standing beside the river, he ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confront the ram. He was moving with rage against him, attacking the ram, and broke his two horns. And when there was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. And therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in its place of it, 4 notable came up towards the 4 winds of heaven. That's through verse 8, right, Bob? Okay. Now, you see this ram with the 2 horns, all powerful almost in the earth. All of a sudden, a goat arrives on the scene. And he immediately contends with a ram for power. Now, rams are male sheep, and male goats are goats, so they're different. So this change in the type of animal would seem to indicate that there's a change in the kingdom. Just like in the statue, the changing in the material, just like the other animals, from the bear to the leper. So it's a change. We know and understand that up to this point. We can conclude that based on what happened in chapter 7. Each beast represents a different kingdom. We already seen that the ram goat is the Medo-Persians, and now we're looking at the kingdom with the capacity to challenge the Persian. Clearly, that leads us to assume the goat represents the Greek Empire. No other empire challenged the Persian Empire until the Greeks destroyed them. No one. So as we look back to the Alexandrian Empire, we find the goat was an ancient symbol for Greece. The constellation Capricorn, which is Latin for great horn, stood for the Greeks in the ancient zodiac. And the feature of this goat matches other aspects of the Greek Empire. First, the goat had a single conspicuous horn. Goats normally have 2 horns, if you know anything about goats. This one has 1. So that suggests that there's a single powerful ruler in the kingdom. It certainly fits with the history of Alexander the Great. Alexander did not have a Congress. He did not have anybody. He ruled the way he wanted to rule. So we see that horn represents Alexander the Great. He ruled along, single-handedly conquering the vast territory that would become the Greek Empire. And I was reading and I saw how many square acres he conquered, and it was ungodly. It was like so many million square acres that Alexander conquered in his life. Next, the way this goat took control from the ram fits history. It says that the goat rushes the ram. First of all, you notice the goat approaches not touching the earth. That shows swiftness. He's not galloping, he's just swift. And that was the mark of the Greek army, was they moved swiftly. They weren't the biggest army. They were anywhere as big as what the Persians were, but they were swift, and he was a military genius, and so he knew how to do it. And then in verse 6, it says that the goat rushed the ram. Certainly, speed was an essential element in Alexander's strategic victory. He reached world dominion in only 10 years from the beginning of his military career. 10 years, Alexander conquered the known world. That is unheard of in that day. He defeated the Near East, Middle East in barely 3 years. So he took over it all. He defeated the Persians in a series of decisive battles that resulted in the end of their reign over the world. Like I said, the Persians greatly outnumbered the Greeks in battle, as was the Persian style of warfare. They would just overman you. That's the way the Persians won their wars. But Alexander was so smart and tactical, he figured out a way to defeat. With speed, he defeated the Persians. We see in verse 7, we're told that the goat completely ends the strength of the ram. Means that they totally crushed the Persians. There wasn't any resistance left when it was over. So when we look at history, and we compare the known history with the prophecy of Daniel, it fits together. That's how you interpret the scriptures when you have a history. You can look back and you see it firmly fits together. In fact, I told you a couple of weeks ago, Alexander referenced Daniel chapter 7 and 8 to his ability or his divine guidance to take over the world. That's what Alexander thought. The confirming details, if we need one, is found in verse 8. Daniel predicts the early death of the leader of this kingdom. When he talks about the horn being broken, he predicts Alexander the Great's early demise. It says that one horn of the goat will be magnify itself, yet at the moment it becomes magnified, it gets broken. What he says that his zenith of power, he's going to be done away with. He's going to die. He's going to pass. And that's exactly what happened. Right after Alexander had conquered the known world, he was headed towards India, and his soldiers got homesick, And so he didn't want a rebellion, so he turns and goes back. And when he gets to Babylon, he takes over the city, and he's going to make that the capital of his empire, the great city of Babylon. And while he's there, just a short time, he passes away, and so he dies. Perfect description. So he turns back, he takes Babylon as his city. Before he could plan the next step of his government, Alexander dies suddenly. And I don't know what the reason of his death was. I think it was by natural causes. The detail is stunning confirmation of the accuracy of Daniel's prophecy. You realize Daniel is in the Babylonian kingdom when he's prophesying hundreds of years in the future that the king of this kingdom is going to die suddenly, and it happens exactly like Daniel says it was. Or we should say, that God predicted it. Daniel just gave us the message. Alexander was, to that point, in the book of Daniel always looked to that and claimed that was his rule to the world. But somehow he overlooked the part about the early death. He didn't get the part about the horn being broken off. After Alexander's death, and we've talked about this before, there was a struggle for control over his kingdom. He did not have a legal heir. He didn't have a son. He didn't have anybody in his family to take over. Eventually, the civil wars resulted in the kingdom being divided in 4 different generals, and 4 different generals went 4 different ways, north, south, east, and west, and that's how they came. There was an east, west, north, and south division of the kingdom. There was also a mirror. The mirror of this is uncanny prediction. We're told that in place of the large horn that was broken off, 4 smaller, less conspicuous horns come up. These were pointing to the 4 winds of heaven. If you were in Revelations, you understand that perfectly. The 4 winds of heaven represents the 4 points on the compass, north, south, east, and west. So that tells us that these kings spread out the kingdom, took over the 4 different directions. Now, this is a matter appointed by God, as they must be, since it's all being described in perfect details hundreds of years in advance. Up to this point, the prophets, we've been treading over ground that we've treaded. We know that even from back in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we know what these represent. So if you're waiting for something new, you're waiting for God to reveal some details he hadn't revealed yet, all right, here it goes. Starting in verse 9, we're going to get to that. This is the part. Now, I want y'all to listen to this part because it's interesting and it's very important. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, the north, the east, and towards the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. And through 14. And even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices and cast the truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Is that, okay, here we go. And then I heard a holy one speak, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of the desolation? And given both of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. And listen to this. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Okay, that is new ground. We have not. That's something totally out of left field that we've not discussed. So let's talk about it. So we see out of these 4 horns that replace the single horn, the 4 generals that take over the Grecian Empire. Out of that, one of them grows powerful. We know these 4 horns represent the 4 generals. So the new smaller horn grows up among these, yet to be another ruler. It draws our attention to the earlier mention of the little horn in chapter 7. Y'all remember that the horn that grew in chapter 7, the small horn that uprooted the 4 horns and took over? And remember who we talked about that was? Anybody remember? It was at the end time, he's going to come to power and he's going to rule for 3.5 years. He's going Antichrist. Thank you. That's the Antichrist. So let's compare. Do you think this is a picture of the Antichrist here? So let's talk about it. Let's see if it is. This little horn is a part. It can't be the Antichrist, and I'm going to give you the reasons why. Okay? Look at me and listen. This little horn is a part of the 3rd kingdom, not the 4th kingdom. So the timeline doesn't fit. The Antichrist does not come to power in the Grecian Empire. He's not one of the generals that rules. So this is not the Antichrist, so let's talk about who it is. He's different than the one in chapter 7. And even the surroundings, his appearance are different in those at the end of the age. Nevertheless, the facts that this symbol is being used for the second time, it's not a coincidence, okay? God doesn't do that. When God, He is tying these two together in our minds, even though they're not the same person. They're the same spirit. They're the same attitude. They're the same symbolism. And that's what He's trying to teach us here. Though they lived in very different times and circumstances, they're connected in spirit and in action. To understand the connection, let's look at what this little horn does. He grows great in three directions: south, east, and towards the beautiful land. What is the beautiful land? That's Bible Study 101. That is Palestine. That is God's land, okay? It's always referred to that way. It's referred to that way in several different Old Testament books, okay? Daniel uses it several terms in the same way. These details help us identify a man who fits this description. Now, I'm going to pronounce it the way I pronounce it. You can pronounce it the way you want to pronounce it. We'll all be happy together. His name is Antiochus IV, okay? Who was the 8th king of the Seleucian Empire. The Seleucid Empire was located in present-day Syria, and it was one of the 4 divisions of the Greek Empire after Alexander's death. He fought against the other Greek divisions, seeking to gain power over them. He fought to gain territory in the east and in the south. And most famously, he invaded Palestine and Jerusalem and the land of Israel. So far, Antiochus IV fits the description of the little horn in chapter 7, or chapter 8, rather. Then in verse 10, we get to the point. The little horn kept growing until it reached the heaven, where it caused the stars to fall to the earth and be trampled. Now, let me remind you that Daniel is describing things he saw in a vision. There's symbolism here, just like we talked about this a lot in Revelations, about symbolism. Things mean something, so we got to go figure out what it meant. This is not literal. This man didn't reach up to heaven and pull down stars. So what does it mean? So let's talk about it. You remember the two rules of prophecy, the 2 rules of interpretation. Number 1 is the Bible will describe or define what God is saying somewhere. And it has to fit into the context. Those are the 2 rules. So let's look at this. Now, in studying in prophecy, in Daniel and Revelations, what did stars falling from heaven most time meant? It meant angels turning into the demonic force that Satan uses on earth. That's mostly where it's used in Revelations, sometimes in Daniel. That's what it means. But if we apply that thought to Daniel, it doesn't fit the context. It doesn't work, because angels coming was not pulled down by Antiochus. That didn't happen, okay? So you got to go further and let the Bible describe it. So we find a passage back in Genesis where it is defined and described that fits our context. You remember when Joseph had the dream. How many remember? Joseph had a dream, and he told his dad and his brothers about a dream where they were the moon, the sun, and the stars, and they were going to bow down to him and worship him. Okay. Now, who were they? They were the sons of Israel, right? That's who they would eventually become. Those 12 brothers were the children of Israel. So I think the meaning here is when he goes into Jerusalem, he is causing the Jewish people to bow down and worship him as God. And if you look at history, that's exactly what he did. When he invaded Israel and took over the temple, he caused them to want them to worship him as God. So we're going to see how that works. That's in Genesis chapter 37, if you're taking notes, where Joseph had the dream about the sun, moon, and stars, and it represented his mother's dad and his brothers, just so you got that reference. So it fits in perfectly, and we know that's what happened. Now, history tells us that Antiochus arrived in Palestine. He came up with a particular vengeance against the Jewish people. In one campaign alone, he killed 40,000 Jews and took another 10,000 into slavery. Having conquered the land, he continued moving south. He was going to attack Egypt, but he engaged a Roman force instead, and the Romans defeated him. Now, the Romans are up and coming. They're not yet at world power, but they do have an army. So they defeat him, and he goes back. He has to retreat back to Palestine. When he gets back to Palestine, he is angry and full of vengeance that he takes out on the Jews, okay? On December 168 BC, he seized Jerusalem on a Sabbath and began to do everything he could, humanly possible, to offend the Jews. The first thing he did was he placed a statue of the pagan god Zeus in the temple. He ordered a pig be sacrificed in the temple and the animal's blood poured on the altar. The act was the most horrifying thing Israel had ever seen in this temple or any temple, because, do you know, in the Jewish faith, the pig is the most unclean animal They're forbidden to eat it. They're forbidden to have any contact with it. And when he did this, they even come up with a special name for it. They called it the abomination of desolation. Okay, that's what they called it. And it's still referred to today as the abomination of desolation. And trust me, the Jews know about it. We see a vile reference to this in verse 11. The little horn will magnify himself to be equal with the commander of hosts. So what he is saying in verse 11 is that Antiochus will rise to say that he's equal with God himself. In fact, he takes another name that he adds to his name, and it's called Epiphanes. He becomes known as Antiochus of Epiphanes. The word Epiphanes means he's a manifestation of God. He believed he was God, okay? And so he goes in and he worships, and then we find that in 171 BC, he removes the legitimate high priest of Israel and appoints a wicked man to serve in that role. This prevented the legitimate daily sacrifices in the temple. Since the man was not truly a high priest, they could not offer any sacrifices in the temple that would be accepted. And his actions against Israel would culminate with a desolation in 168 BC. In verse 12, Daniel is told these things will come to pass because of Israel's transgression. It's a reference to Israel's failure to keep the old covenant with God. It's Israel's failure to keep their covenant with God that brought the age of the Gentiles to pass. And this passage is a confirmation that these terrible events are ordained by God in keeping with the promise of the penalties of the old covenant. The host of Israel will be given to the hands of man for a time, and he will also fling the truth to the ground. Israel and the temple were intended to be testimonies of the truth of God, so that truth is trampled underfoot by the Grecian general, and the worst thing that could ever happen happened. Now, in verses 13 and 14, Daniel overhears a conversation between two angels. I think this is really cool. Would you like to be in that dream? He's two angels talking, or so it seems. So one angel turns to the other angel and asks, how long will Israel be subject to these things? Now, they weren't saying that because they wanted to know. They already knew. They were saying that for Daniel's benefit, so Daniel could write it down so we could look back and say, wow, look what God did. It seems that Daniel didn't even know what question to ask, so they asked it for him. And the answer to that question is 2,300 evenings and mornings, or 2,300 days, 24-hour days. He's referring to the Jewish day. And all these things will last 6 years, 4 months, and 20 days. And once again, history bears out the truth of this. Beginning on September the 9th, 171 BC, the regular authorized sacrifices were not possible without a legitimate priest. But the Maccabean revolt ended with a rededication of the temple on December the 25th, 165 BC, allowed Israel to reinstate their sacrifice. Do you know how long that was? That was 2,300 days, exactly, just like God told Daniel that it would be. Here again, the accuracy of Daniel's prediction is uncanny. We should expect nothing less from God, of course, but at this point, these prophecies are clearly from God. It's not merely predicting the future. He's controlling it as he chooses. He's basically pulling back and let Daniel see, just like he does for us in Revelations and in the latter part of this fourth kingdom. Now, at this point, we've been trying to understand these visions based on the analysis and symbols of compared to history. But of course, Daniel didn't have the benefit of hindsight as he received these messages the first time. So he's thoroughly confused about what the meaning is. So next week, we'll look at the interpretation. And I find it incredibly interesting that both visions, both dreams, God gives the interpretation to Daniel. He didn't leave it to chance. He didn't leave it for us to mess it up. He didn't leave it for us to put in our thoughts and our ideas. He didn't even leave it up to Daniel, who was the great interpreter of dreams. God said, I'm going to make sure you understand it. And he reveals a little bit more next week about who Antiochus is and what his purpose was for being on the scene. I'll go too far, I better stop. I'm going to give away a spoiler alert. But it's a shadow and a type. Just like Hitler was a shadow and a type. Antiochus was more in line with what the Antichrist will be. They got a preview of coming attractions with him. And he talks a little bit about that in the latter part of this chapter. Next week, we'll look at the interpretation. We'll go through that pretty quick because, I've pre-read it. I know we're right. So that's kind of where we are here at the end of the middle ways of chapter 8. Do y'all find this as interesting and intriguing as I do? I think it is so freaking cool the way God reveals stuff to us. I mean, Daniel, he could have just showed the kingdoms marching, but he chose to do it in such a way that it makes it interesting, and we got to dig it out and find it. So anyway, we'll stop right there at chapter 8, verse 14. We'll pick up next week with the rest of that. We'll finish that chapter next week, and we'll move on forward. Now, quickly, any questions?